So to finish, to finish, why is it that I've taken you guys through this entire thing? The purpose is twofold. Number one was to show you that we cannot be or we cannot allow our circumstances, however bad they are, to define us. So that is an idea that I profoundly reject. We cannot let our circumstances define us. That I will say it again, and that is the big problem. I don't want those ideas to define us. I want to believe that as people, we are resilient. Faced with extraordinary power, problems will rise up to the occasion and will solve them. That's number one. Number two is the question that I asked earlier is why is it that we are only meant to talk about one problem that happened in the past regarding slavery when we know that the Arab Muslim slave trade was far worse, much far worse. Take a look.
The Islamic world was very different from that in the West. Despite the larger total numbers of slaves sent from Africa to the Islamic world over the centuries, the surviving African population in these countries was much less than the tens of millions in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to higher mortality rates of slaves en route to North African and Middle Eastern countries, the survival and reproduction rates of African slaves there were much less than in the United States. While slaves in the antebellum South lived in families, even though they lacked official legal sanction for their marriages, both marriage and casual sex among slaves were suppressed in the Islamic world, and among the relatively small numbers of children born to African slaves there, the mortality rate was so high that few lived to adulthood. The sex imbalance among African slaves, far more women than men in the Islamic countries, and the fact that eunuchs were common among the relatively few African men, likewise precluded a vast African slave population in the Muslim countries. Among the European galley slaves in North Africa, there was even less chance for them to reproduce, and the European women who were domestic servants or concubines were in no position to leave behind European offspring raised in a European culture. The children born to them, fathered by North African or Middle Eastern slave owners, were absorbed both biologically and culturally into the Islamic world. By the late 18th century, visitors were commenting on the lighter complexions of the inhabitants of Algiers. What the United States had, that the Islamic world did not have, was a self-sustaining and racially distinct population of major proportions within the larger society. Non-Western countries in general faced neither the social nor the moral dilemmas that confronted 19th century Americans. Moreover, the emancipation of slaves was not an issue faced by non-Western societies, but rather was something imposed on them by the West. Even European powers with substantial slave populations in their Western Hemisphere colonies faced no major domestic social consequences from the freeing of those slaves, however much that might have economic repercussions, for their slaves were freed on the other side of the ocean. Both slavery and emancipation were peculiar in their consequences on American soil. It may be significant that the only other independent nation in the Western Hemisphere with a large slave population, Brazil, was the last Western nation to abolish the institution, a quarter of a century after the United States.
So there you go, guys. So you've seen it and heard it for yourselves, right? And I think it is right to ask the question, exactly where are we going? What are we doing? Okay. I am sick and tired of people not teaching the right thing. You want to teach about slavery? Let's get to it. We will learn everything. But you must also, for example, be able to teach that, hey, the war was also another type of slavery that happened much longer, number one. And for those of you who actually don't know, even the word slave is come from Slavic people, mainly from the Balkans, meaning Bulgaria, countries like Bulgaria, Greece even, at some point, they were ruled under the Ottoman, and a lot of people who happened to be white were also slaves for centuries until they rose militarily in order to prevent that from happening, and they were able to protect their own people. But for centuries, they were also used. Are we going to talk about that? Or I guess not, because the Arabs also enslaved Europeans a lot in the past. Okay? This is just how it is. The Arabs enslaved Africans for much longer. In fact, about 13 centuries instead of the 4 or 5 centuries roughly that the slave trade was running, the transatlantic slave trade at least. So why are we not allowed to talk about that? I guess it is also uncomfortable. So you're claiming that you want to teach the whole of history, but then you purposely cut a big part of it. If your point, which is, I know this is the point that they're trying to make, is the point regarding reparation, why is it then that those people don't spend the time to actually, for example, research what happened to on the east side of Africa with 8 to 17 million people uh, who were plucked from the continent, taken away. Many of them died along the way with disease of just exhaustion. So if we're going to make the point that reparation needs to happen, is it not therefore not logical that the first people that we need to ask reparation from are those who were the first one to actually start the slave trade, the Muslims and the Arabs? But I guess no, that is simply inconvenient. You see, it doesn't fit with the narrative of intersectionality. You see, and that's why that is ignored. But if you really have to follow that, okay, number one, it's a fool's errand because really, your reparation, nobody is ever going to. It sounds nice, but everybody knows it's never going to happen. But if you at least be consistent, You want to talk about that? Fair enough. Talk about the one that actually attracted or caused the death of much more people, many more people. For example, we do not have we don't have traces of that, but the reason why, for example, in the Arab world, we have so few black people who remained is because most men were castrated. That is the reality. And when those kids, when for the few of them who were not eunuchs and were able to have kids, most of them ended up not actually even being able to reproduce properly. So, and you can see that in the other video that is going to come up. So this is the reality, guys. So I hope that people will understand what's the issue here, and at least be intellectually consistent with yourselves. You want to go after slavery? Let's go after slavery. And let's go after even the people who are today are also causing slavery to continue. If you're not prepared to have that conversation, then maybe not start it. That is just my opinion. So, I guess that is it for me today. Until next time, peace.